That morning at the airport, the smell of coffee and perfume hung in the air like a cruel reminder that life was moving forward for everyone but me. Families rushed past with laughter, pulling wheeled suitcases that clicked against the polished floor. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, eager to board planes that would take them to somewhere warm, somewhere new. I was one of them too, or at least I thought I was. My son Daniel had insisted, "Dad, this trip will be good for you. You've never seen the coast the way we're going to see it." For weeks, I'd held on to that promise like a child clutches a gift, but at the gate, the promise shattered. Daniel stood there with his new wife, Claire, her manicured hand gripping his arm as if he were a trophy to be polished. Not a man who once cried into my shoulder when he was small. His eyes flicked to mine and then away, avoiding the weight of what he was about to say. "Dad," he whispered, low enough that only I could hear, "we can't take you with us. It's complicated." I blinked, not sure I'd heard him right. The loudspeaker called another boarding group, and for a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it. "Complicated?" I asked, my voice thin, almost cracking. "Daniel." The ticket, my suitcase, I packed everything. My hand tightened on the handle of the old leather bag I'd bought decades ago when I still dreamed of traveling with his mother. The bag felt heavier in that moment than it ever had before. Claire's voice cut through, sharp as glass. "It's just better this way. We want to enjoy ourselves. And honestly, dragging your father along on a honeymoon isn't appropriate." She smiled, but it wasn't kind. It was the sort of smile people wear when they're winning a game you didn't know you were playing. Daniel's jaw clenched. He couldn't meet my eyes. "Dad, you'll understand one day," he muttered. And then just like that, they turned toward the gate, their boarding passes flashing under the scanner. I stood there, my chest hollow, watching my son disappear down the jet bridge, with a woman who barely knew the weight of the years we had carried together. Around me, the airport carried on. A young man kissed his mother's cheek before leaving, promising to call. A husband carried his wife's bag so she could hold their child. Small mercies everywhere, each one slicing deeper into me. My suitcase sat at my side, useless now, like me. I lowered myself onto a cold plastic bench, the kind that never feels comfortable no matter how long you sit. My reflection stared back from the darkened window. An old man, with tired eyes, left behind not by strangers, but by his own blood. And as the engines of their plane roared to life somewhere beyond the glass, I wondered if this was the day I had stopped being Daniel's father and become nothing more than an inconvenience. I didn't know then that this abandonment at the gate was only the beginning of something much darker that would unfold when I returned home. The bench was hard beneath me, its plastic edges biting into my back as though the airport itself wanted me gone. People bustled all around, their voices rising and falling in 100 different melodies of excitement, irritation, and love. I sat in the middle of it all, invisible, clutching the handle of my suitcase like it was an anchor keeping me from drifting away entirely. The announcement board flickered, showing Daniel's flight as departed. One word, and my life felt smaller than ever before. A little girl in a pink sweater skipped past, her father carrying her doll so she could run freely. I followed them with my eyes, my chest tightening. That used to be me, carrying Daniel on my shoulders at the fair, his laughter spilling into the summer night. Back then, he would grip my hair like reins and shout, "Faster, Dad, faster!" as if I was his whole world. And now here I was, left behind like luggage too heavy to be worth carrying. I pulled my phone from my pocket, staring at the dark screen. Should I call him? Should I beg him to turn around before the plane took off? My thumb hovered over his name, but my pride trembled like a fragile thread. A father shouldn't have to beg his own son for space in his life. Still, loneliness pressed on me so hard, I finally tapped his number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before his voice answered, hushed, and hurried. "Dad, we're boarding. Don't make this harder." Then silence. He had ended the call before I could speak. I sat there a long while after that, listening to the hollow hum of the terminal. A janitor swept near my feet and gave me a sympathetic glance, but said nothing. I lowered my eyes, ashamed, as if I had done something to deserve this abandonment. When I finally stood, my knees ached from sitting too long, and the suitcase wheels rattled against the floor as I dragged it toward the exit. Each sound echoed the truth I couldn't yet accept. My son had chosen a life where I was not welcome. Outside, the evening air was damp, carrying the faint scent of rain. Taxis pulled up one after another, swallowing passengers who were greeted with open arms on the other side. I climbed into the back of one alone, my bag beside me, and as the driver asked where to, my voice caught in my throat. For a moment, I almost said, anywhere but home. But in the end, I whispered my address and leaned against the cold window, watching the airport fade into a blur of lights and regret. What I didn't know then was that returning to that quiet apartment would open a door to memories I had long tried to bury. The apartment greeted me with silence, the kind that doesn't soothe but suffocates. I placed my suitcase by the door, still packed with shirts neatly folded for a trip that never began. The air smelled faintly of dust and the lavender detergent I'd used the night before. I sank into the armchair by the window, staring at nothing, and the weight of it all pressed down until my mind, desperate for comfort, drifted backward. I saw myself as a younger man, hands rough with calluses, working double shifts at the steel yard. Mornings began before the sun, evenings ended long after it fell. My back ached every day, but I carried that pain like a badge because it meant Daniel had food on his plate and shoes on his feet. His mother, my Margaret, had been gone for years by then, taken far too soon, and I was left with a boy whose eyes mirrored hers. Those eyes kept me alive. I remembered one winter when Daniel was 8. The furnace broke, and the house froze like a tomb. I wrapped him in my coat, holding him close while we boiled water on the stove for warmth. He asked, "Dad, are we poor?" I kissed the top of his head and said, "No, son, we're rich in ways money can't measure." But deep inside, I felt the sting of truth. We had little more than each other. And yet, wasn't that enough? There were brighter memories, too. His first bicycle, bought second-hand with wages I should have used to fix the roof. The way he laughed as he wobbled down the sidewalk, falling once, then twice, before finding his balance. He had turned to me, cheeks flushed, and shouted, "You see, Dad? I can do it." In that moment, I believed the sacrifices were worth every sleepless night. But time has a way of turning devotion into dust. The very hours I spent working to build his future became the hours he grew distant. He didn't see the man holding together the edges of his world. He only saw the gaps. I remember when he was a teenager, embarrassed by my worn boots and old truck. "Why can't you dress like other dads?" he once snapped. I laughed it off then, telling myself it was just youth speaking. But maybe it was the first crack in something I thought unbreakable. Sitting in the stillness of that apartment, the images tumbled one after another: birthdays where I stretched every dollar for cake and balloons, late nights bent over his homework by lamplight, whispered prayers that I'd live long enough to see him stand tall. And I thought of the words he once said, so long ago, words that had carried me through storms. "One day, Dad, I'll take you to see the world. At the airport, that promise had died. I didn't yet know, though, that it would come back to haunt me in a way I could never have imagined. I can still see it, as clear as if it happened yesterday. Daniel was 12, gangly, and all knees and elbows, with a mop of dark hair that always fell into his eyes. We had walked home from the library that evening, the sky painted with the last light of day. He clutched a book about world explorers, his voice bubbling with excitement as he read passages aloud while we trudged up the hill toward our small house. I listened, smiling at the way he mispronounced names like Magellan and Vespucci but pressed on anyway, determined to know the world beyond our neighborhood. Inside, I made us sandwiches, peanut butter for him, cheese and tomato for me, and we ate sitting on the living room floor because the old couch had lost 2 springs and threatened to swallow us whole. He looked up from his sandwich, eyes shining with a dream too big for the room we were in. "Dad," he said between bites, "one day, I'll take you to see the world. Planes, ships, everything. You won't have to work anymore. I'll take care of you." I laughed softly then, not because I doubted him, but because of the sweetness in his voice. "That sounds wonderful, son. Where will we go first?" He grinned wide, smearing peanut butter across his cheek. "Paris. Or maybe the pyramids. Or the ocean. I want you to see the ocean, Dad." He said it like it was the most precious gift he could ever give me. I tucked that promise away in the quiet corners of my heart. Through years of long shifts, unpaid bills, and winters where the walls shivered with cold, I pulled it out, like a photograph, reminding myself that one day, the boy who leaned against my shoulder that night would keep his word. The thought warmed me when exhaustion threatened to break me. When I came home to empty rooms echoing with Margaret's absence. When the loneliness of being both father and mother nearly crushed me. But sitting in that apartment after the airport betrayal, the memory twisted like a knife. He had promised me the world, yet left me stranded at the gate, not even worth a seat at his side. I stared at the packed suitcase by the door, remembering his 12-year-old voice filled with hope, and wondered when that boy had disappeared. Was it gradual, like sand slipping from an hourglass? Or had there been one moment where the love cracked and began to fall away? The promise of travel had kept me alive in ways Daniel never understood. And now, after watching him walk away, I couldn't help but feel that he hadn't just broken a promise, he had broken the very foundation of who we once were. I didn't yet realize that the new woman by his side had more to do with that transformation than I dared to admit. Her name was Claire. The first time Daniel introduced her, he wore a suit that didn't fit his shoulders, and a nervous smile that made me think he was still a boy pretending to be a man. Claire, though she wasn't pretending anything, she carried herself like someone stepping into a stage she believed was built for her. Perfectly pressed dress, perfume that filled the air before her voice did, and a gaze that swept across my modest living room as if she were already rearranging it to her liking. She smiled politely when I offered her tea, but her eyes never settled on me for long. They lingered instead on Daniel, the way a jeweler admires a diamond they've decided belongs in their collection. At dinner that evening, she complimented the roast chicken I had cooked, though the words felt more like courtesy than truth. "It's very homey," she said, setting her fork down neatly, her hands folded as if she'd been trained for an audience I wasn't part of. Daniel beamed at her every word, eager for my approval. "Dad, isn't she wonderful?" he asked. I nodded, but something inside me hesitated. It wasn't jealousy. It was a quiet warning, the kind that echoes in a father's bones when he senses his child is walking toward a cliff. The little signs began to appear after that. Subtle at first. So subtle, I almost convinced myself they weren't there. When Daniel invited me to lunch one weekend, Claire suggested it would be better if it's just us, so we can have some couples time. When we all went to a family gathering, she positioned herself between us, answering questions on his behalf, as if she already held the rights to his voice. And when I offered stories about Daniel as a boy, funny ones, tender ones, she laughed politely but changed the subject, her hand tightening on his arm, steering him away from memories that didn't include her. Still, I told myself she would grow to accept me. Love, after all, expands, doesn't it? A family is supposed to stretch and bend to fit the new branches. But every time I visited, the house felt tighter. My chair at the table was moved closer to the corner. My words, once received with laughter or thought, now fell into silences Claire filled with her own. I wasn't part of their new world. I was tolerated, like wallpaper in a room waiting to be painted over. I tried not to let it wound me. I told myself Daniel was in love, that he was blinded by the shine of something new. But there were nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Margaret's picture on the nightstand, and whispered, "If you were here, you'd see it too. You'd see how she's pulling him away." I didn't know then how far that pull would go, or that it would end with me standing alone at an airport gate, watching the two of them vanish into a life where I no longer belonged. The rejections never came in loud arguments or cruel words. They arrived quietly, like a draft, seeping through cracks in the window, subtle enough that Daniel could pretend they weren't there, sharp enough that I felt every chill. At first, it was the dinners. I used to be invited every Sunday, a tradition I had held on to since he was a boy. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, a bottle of cheap red wine, simple meals that carried the weight of family. But soon the invitations slowed. "Dad, we're busy this weekend," Daniel would say. His voice rushed, eyes darting away. And when I suggested another day, Claire would add, "Oh, we'll see. Our schedules are just so full right now." The words were polite, but the meaning was clear. There was no seat at their table for me anymore. The small changes stacked one on top of the other. At Christmas, my name card was shifted from the head of the table to the far end, near the kitchen door. At birthdays, my gifts were opened last, after Claire's families had already filled the room with their polished laughter and expensive wrappings. I still remember one evening when I brought a framed photograph of Daniel as a child missing tooth, hair sticking up, his hand clutching a balloon from the fair. I thought it would be a sweet memory to place on their mantel. Claire smiled thinly when she saw it. "Oh, how cute," she said, before sliding it behind a stack of glossy wedding photos. That frame was never displayed again. I told myself not to take it to heart. But how does a father not feel the walls closing in when every trace of his place in his child's life is quietly erased? Even Daniel's language began to change. He stopped calling me Dad in public, opting instead for "my father," spoken with a certain distance, as though the word carried weight he no longer wished to bear. When neighbors or friends asked about me, he would shrug. "He's managing," he'd say, the way someone speaks of a distant relative, not the man who once carried him on his shoulders to see fireworks in the summer sky. What hurt most wasn't the silence in their invitations, or even the removal of my chair at the table. It was Daniel's eyes. Whenever I caught them lingering on me, there was a flicker of guilt quickly hidden behind Claire's approving smile. He knew. Deep down, he knew what was happening, but he let it continue, let her set the stage where I no longer had a role. I would return home to my small apartment, sit in my worn armchair, and stare at the empty plate I had set out for myself, whispering into the quiet, "When did love become an inconvenience?" I didn't realize then that the greatest rejection was still waiting for me, wrapped in the form of a lie told at the airport gates. At the airport, the excuse came dressed in politeness, but it stung sharper than any blunt truth. Daniel shifted uneasily, clutching his passport, his eyes refusing to settle on mine. Claire was the one who spoke, her tone smooth, rehearsed. "There was a mistake with the tickets," she said, brushing invisible dust off her sleeve. "The airline said it would be too complicated to fix at the last minute. We thought it would be best if you just stayed." Her words were dipped in sugar, but I could taste the bitterness beneath them. I frowned, confused, searching Daniel's face for honesty. "Too complicated? We booked together. I gave you the money months ago. Where's my ticket?" My voice cracked, not with anger, but with disbelief. I wanted him to look at me the way he used to, when he was caught in a lie, as a boy ashamed, ready to confess. But he didn't. He glanced at Claire, waiting for her nod, then muttered, "Dad, it's not what you think. The system messed up. You'll understand later." The system. That was the best he could do? I stood there with my suitcase at my side, feeling the weight of every hour I had worked, every overtime shift I had taken to make sure he could go to college, every late night I had stayed awake so he could sleep without worry. Now the man who once promised to take me to see the ocean told me the system had left me behind. And worse, he expected me to believe it. Claire leaned in, her perfume sharp, her smile sharper. "Don't make this harder, Mr. Carter. We don't want to argue. We just want to start our trip peacefully." "Mr. Carter. Not Dad. Not even Robert. Just a surname. As if I were a stranger holding them up in line. That was when the truth sank in not only had they left me without a ticket, they had planned it this way all along. The boarding call rang out again, echoing through the terminal like a cruel countdown. Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder, quick and awkward, as if touching me burned him. "We'll talk when we're back," he said. "Please, don't make a scene." And then, with a final glance, half pity, half guilt, he turned away. His arm slipped into Claire's as they walked toward the gate, their figures swallowed by the line of travelers who had a place in the world I was just denied. I stood frozen, clutching my suitcase so tightly my knuckles turned white. Around me, life moved on. Families laughing, couples whispering, children tugging at their parents' sleeves. No one noticed the old man left behind. And as their plane engines thundered to life beyond the glass, I realized I hadn't been forgotten by accident. I had been erased on purpose. I didn't yet know, though, that the silence that followed their departure would cut deeper than the abandonment itself. When I finally gathered the strength to leave the terminal, the world outside felt colder than it should have. The night air pressed against my skin as I climbed into the back of a cab, my suitcase sliding onto the seat beside me like a reminder of the trip that never began. The driver asked, "Where to?" I gave him my address in a voice so faint he leaned closer just to hear it. I kept my eyes on the passing streetlights, each one flickering by like a heartbeat, steady and indifferent to my pain. Back home, the apartment smelled of stale coffee and loneliness. I set the suitcase down by the door and left it there unopened. What use was there in unpacking shirts folded for days of travel that would never come? The silence pressed against me, and in that silence my phone lay heavy in my pocket. I pulled it out, staring at Daniel's name on the screen. For minutes I hesitated. What would I even say? Would my voice come out as anger? Or would it break into the sorrow I tried so hard to swallow? At last, I pressed the button. The line rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Then his voice. Hushed. Hurried. Like a man caught in something shameful. "Dad? We're boarding. Don't make this harder." Before I could answer, the call ended. I held the phone to my ear long after the line went dead, listening to the hollow hum that filled the emptiness where his words should have been. My hand trembled as I lowered the phone, not from age, but from the realization that my son had silenced me with the ease of closing a door. I sank into the armchair, the same chair where I once read him stories before bed, his small head resting against my shoulder. I could still hear his childhood voice asking me to read one more page, see his sleepy smile as I carried him to bed. Those memories collided with the sound of that hurried voice on the phone, and I felt something inside me collapse. A father shouldn't have to beg his own son for a place in his life. Yet here I was, pleading into a line that had already gone cold. I set the phone on the table, screen facing down. The glow of it against the wood seemed almost cruel, a small beacon of connection that no longer belonged to me. Outside, the city hummed, cars moving, lives unfolding, while in my apartment the silence grew heavy enough to crush me. And as I sat there, staring at the packed suitcase by the door, I understood that his absence would not be brief. This wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a choice. And choices like that leave marks no apology can erase. I didn't know it yet, but the days ahead would show me just how deep those marks could go. The apartment had never felt so foreign. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, but instead of comfort, the air met me with a chill that sank into my bones. The suitcase still sat by the entrance, unopened, like an unspoken reminder of the journey that never began. Its wheels left faint streaks on the floor, as if even they carried the shame of being dragged home too soon. I closed the door behind me, and the sound echoed through the empty rooms, louder than it should have been. Silence has a way of magnifying itself when there's no one to share it with. I lowered myself into the armchair by the window, the same one where I had rocked Daniel to sleep when he was small. Back then, his tiny frame had curled against my chest, his breath warm, his trust complete. Now all I held was the weight of my own disappointment, pressing against me heavier than the years on my back. I stared at the framed photo on the side table, Daniel at 8 years old, grinning with a missing tooth, holding the kite we had built together out of spare wood and torn fabric. That boy was still my son, but the man who walked away from me at the gate felt like a stranger wearing his face. The hours dragged. I tried to distract myself with the television, but every channel was filled with voices that weren't mine, faces that weren't his. I heated a bowl of soup, but it tasted like nothing, the spoon clinking against the bowl in the kind of silence that makes your chest ache. I caught myself setting out 2 slices of bread on the counter, a habit left over from when Daniel used to stop by after work. The second slice lay untouched, its absence heavier than the bread itself. I put it back in the bag, ashamed of my own hope. At one point, I scrolled through my phone. That's when I saw it, his name, tagged in photos from the trip. Daniel and Claire, standing on a sunlit beach, her arm looped around his, champagne glasses in hand. His smile stretched wide, effortless, as if the airport scene had never happened, as if I were nothing more than a shadow in his past. The caption read, "Finally, living the dream." My chest tightened until I had to put the phone down. Living the dream. And what was I doing? Sitting in a dark apartment, the dream long gone. The silence louder with each passing hour. I leaned back in the chair, eyes closed, and whispered into the empty room, "Margaret, if only you could see this. If only you could tell me how to reach him." But there was no answer. Only the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the wall clock. The silence wasn't just around me anymore, it was inside me, filling every corner. And in that silence, I began to realize that this wasn't just abandonment. It was erasure. I didn't yet know that the silence itself would become the stage for the cruelest discovery of all. It was late. The kind of late when the street outside quiets down and the hum of the refrigerator feels like a voice trying to remind you you're not completely alone. I should have gone to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. My mind spun like the hands of the clock on the wall, circling back to the same questions with no answers. That's when I picked up my phone again, against my better judgment. One simple scroll became a wound I hadn't prepared myself to reopen. There they were, Daniel and Claire, plastered across the screen in photograph after photograph. Smiling on the deck of a boat, their hair windswept by the ocean breeze. Reclining on a cabana bed, champagne flutes raised high against the glow of a setting sun. Her captions were full of glittering words. Finally free. Living our best life. No baggage. Just bliss. Asterisk. Each phrase sliced through me, especially that one times. No baggage. Asterisk. I knew she hadn't written it for me, but it was impossible not to feel the weight of those words pressing me further into the shadows. Was that what I was now? Baggage? My thumb hovered over the images, torn between anger and longing. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I studied every detail as if the photographs could explain where I had gone wrong. Daniel's smile. It wasn't the smile of a man who had left his father behind at an airport gate. It was lighter, unburdened. And that was what cut deepest. How could his joy shine so brightly while my chest was hollow? I thought back to when he was 12, promising me the world. I thought of the kite we had built, the nights we shared sandwiches because I couldn't afford more. None of those moments seemed to exist in his eyes anymore. I enlarged one photo, Daniel standing ankle-deep in turquoise water, Claire leaning into him with her head on his shoulder. Behind them stretched an endless horizon, the kind of view I had once hoped to share with him. I pressed my finger against the screen, tracing the curve of his smile like a fool, as if I could touch him through the glass. But all I felt was the cold surface, a reminder of the distance between us. I set the phone down, my hands trembling. The apartment was too quiet. The silence now heavier than any noise could have been. I pressed my palms to my face, trying to stop the flood of memories crashing in the nights I stayed awake, fixing a leaking roof so he wouldn't sleep under the drip, the mornings I walked to work in the rain so he could take the bus to school dry. I whispered into the dark, "Did you forget all of it, son? Or did you just decide it never mattered?" The phone buzzed once more. Another notification, another smiling image I couldn't bring myself to open. Instead, I pushed the device away and reached for the drawer beside my chair. Inside, buried under old receipts and forgotten letters, lay the one thing that had carried me through darker days. A worn leather journal. I hadn't opened it in years. That night, though, my hand found it as if guided. I didn't know then that within its pages waited a truth I had long forgotten, a truth that would change how I saw everything. The journal smelled faintly of dust and leather when I pulled it from the drawer, its cover scuffed from years of being opened and closed by hands much steadier than mine are now. I hadn't touched it in so long that I had almost forgotten it existed. Margaret had given it to me once, saying, "Write it down, Robert. All the things you can't say out loud." At first, I used it sparingly: grocery lists, notes about bills. But over time, it became the place where I poured the pieces of my life I didn't want to lose. It was my ledger of sacrifice, written in ink instead of blood. I flipped it open carefully, the pages soft with age, and my eyes landed on one of the first entries. Worked late, bought Daniel new shoes, skipped supper. The handwriting was younger, firmer, but I could still see the weariness in each letter. Another entry. Roof leaked again. Put off the repair. Used the money for his school trip. He smiled when he came home, worth it. The words blurred for a moment as my eyes filled, not from the weakness of age, but from the sharp sting of remembering. Every line was a receipt of love. Payment I gave, willingly, never expecting a return. I turned more pages, the ink spilling with years of choices. Double shift today. Missed church. Bought him the bike he wanted. And then, Margaret would be proud. Daniel got top marks in math. The journal wasn't just my voice. It was proof that through every hardship, every night, I came home too tired to stand. My boy was at the center of my life. Proof that his future had been bought with my present. As I read, I found myself speaking to the empty room. You see, son? You were never baggage. You were my reason. The words fell heavy, swallowed by the silence. I traced one page where I had taped a receipt from the library, dated the day he'd checked out that book on explorers. Below it, in shaky handwriting, I'd written, "One day, he says he'll take me to see the ocean." I closed my eyes, hearing his young voice again, full of promise. How cruel it felt now, remembering it from the cold seat of an airport where he had walked away. I closed the journal gently, holding it against my chest, as though it were the only proof left that I hadn't imagined a lifetime of devotion. My breath slowed, but inside my chest, the ache only grew heavier. The journal was evidence, but it was also a mirror, and the reflection staring back was a man who had given everything only to be forgotten. I set it back on the table, the lamp's light catching on the worn edges, and whispered, "At least these pages remember me, even if he does not." What I didn't realize as I slid it aside was that the world outside my walls had already begun whispering too, that others were noticing what had happened at that airport, and soon, the silence of my apartment would be filled with the weight of neighbors' voices I wasn't ready to hear. It started with glances, the kind you feel before you see. When I stepped out of my apartment the next morning to buy bread and milk, Mrs. Green from across the hall paused in her sweeping. Her eyes lingered on me, then quickly darted away as though she'd been caught staring. I thought little of it at first, until I reached the corner store. The cashier, a young man who usually greeted me with a bright, "Morning, Mr. Carter," gave me only a tight smile. His voice was careful, too careful, as if he'd been told not to ask a question burning at the edge of his tongue. By the third day, I knew. The whispers had begun to spread. When I walked down the block, two neighbors huddled by the fence hushed their voices as I passed. But not enough to drown the words. "At the airport, can you believe it?" one murmured. "Left him standing there like—" The rest of the sentence trailed off, swallowed by the shame of saying it aloud. But I had heard enough. My private wound had become public gossip. I carried the bread home under my arm, my chest tight. Inside the apartment, the walls felt closer, pressing in on me. I sat at the kitchen table, the loaf still warm against my palm, and thought of how humiliation multiplies when it escapes your own heart and lands in the mouths of others. It wasn't just my silence anymore. It was theirs too, every sideways glance, every hushed conversation that reminded me I was not only abandoned, but pitied. That evening, I opened the window and heard voices drifting from the courtyard below. Two tenants chatted while hanging laundry. One said, "His son didn't even look back. Just boarded the plane with that wife of his." The other clicked her tongue. "Poor man. After everything he did for that boy." Their words struck harder than I wanted to admit. Poor man. The phrase wrapped around me like a chain, heavier than the suitcase still sitting by the door. I found myself speaking to the empty air, my voice trembling. I am not a poor man. I've worked, I've sacrificed. I've lived with dignity. But dignity feels fragile when it becomes a topic for strangers to dissect. I closed the window, the laughter and whispers shutting out with it, and leaned against the sill, my shoulders heavy. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was exposure. My pain had leaked into the world like a secret I never meant to share. And yet, in the middle of that shame, came something unexpected. A knock at the door. When I opened it, standing there was Thomas, an old friend from the neighborhood, his brow furrowed with concern. "Robert," he said quietly, "I heard what happened. You don't deserve this. You shouldn't face it alone." His presence in that moment felt like a crack of light through the heavy dark. I didn't know then that his visit would be the beginning of something larger, a truth about my life and my son that would force me to see everything differently. Thomas stood in the doorway with a gentleness that unsettled me. He wasn't the kind of man to waste words. His hair had gone gray like mine. His shoulders stooped a little from years of hauling lumber and working odd jobs. But his eyes, steady and kind, hadn't changed since we were young men raising our families on the same block. For a moment, I wanted to close the door, to protect what little pride I had left. But the look on his face stopped me. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. He'd carried his own disappointments, his own quiet battles. He knew the language of betrayal too well. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice was low, respectful. I stepped aside, and he entered, glancing at the suitcase by the door before settling into the chair across from mine. The silence stretched between us until he broke it with a sigh. "Robert, I won't dance around it. I heard what happened at the airport. Folks are talking, and I didn't want you to sit here thinking no one cares." His words landed heavy, but there was warmth in them too. The kind that tells you you're not invisible. I lowered my gaze, ashamed. "There's nothing to say, Thomas." He left me there like a stranger. Maybe I should have expected it. Maybe I pushed too much, wanting to be part of his life. The confession burned my throat. Admitting weakness never came easy. Thomas leaned forward, his rough hands folded on the table. "Don't you dare blame yourself. You gave that boy everything. I saw it with my own eyes every shift you worked, every time you went without so he could have more. A father's love isn't the problem here. His choices are." He paused, his jaw tightening. "And that woman, she's steering him farther than he realizes." The mention of Claire made my chest tighten. I thought back to her careful smiles, the way she moved Daniel away from me piece by piece, until I was left on the outside of a life I had built. "She has his ear," I murmured. "And he listens, even when it costs him his own father." Thomas nodded, his eyes steady. "That's why you need to be careful now. You may feel alone, but you're not powerless." He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a folded card on the table. It was worn at the edges, but I recognized it immediately, the number of his cousin, a lawyer who had helped neighbors more than once when trouble came knocking. "If things go further, you call him. Don't sit in silence and let them take more from you." I stared at the card, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It felt heavy, heavier than paper had any right to feel. Not because of the name printed on it, but because of what it represented. An acknowledgement that what happened wasn't just humiliation. It was the beginning of something that could strip me of more than pride if I didn't stand firm. Thomas placed a hand on my shoulder before leaving. "You still have rights, Robert. Don't let them convince you otherwise." His grip was strong, steady, the kind of touch that roots you back to the earth when you feel like floating away. When the door closed behind him, I sat in the dim light with the card pressed between my palms. For the first time since the gate, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Not anger, not even hope. Resolve. What I didn't yet know was that the silence in my apartment wouldn't remain mine alone. Because hidden beneath the surface was a secret Daniel had never spoken of. A detail about our lives and my sacrifices that would soon rise to the surface and turn everything I thought I knew upside down. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table long after the clock struck midnight. Thomas's words circling in my head like restless birds. The card with his cousin's number lay beside my cup of cold coffee. But I didn't touch it. My hands instead found the journal again, as though it had been waiting. I flipped through the pages, slower this time, pausing on notes I had written about money. Not much of it, but enough to tell a story. That was when I remembered something I hadn't thought of in years. There had been a small settlement after Margaret's passing, nothing extravagant, but it was money I never touched, money I tucked away, like a sacred offering. I had placed it in a modest trust, naming Daniel as the future beneficiary, but keeping myself as the sole controller while I lived. Back then, I thought it was a gesture of love, a way to ensure he'd always have a cushion when life grew hard. But now, staring at those faded notes, I realized how naive I had been, because while I had never spoken of it, Daniel must have found out somehow, and if Claire knew, that would explain so much: the coldness, the distance, the decision to push me out at the airport as if I were nothing but an obstacle in their way. I rose from the chair and went to the small lockbox hidden in my closet. The key turned stiffly, the hinges groaning, as if resisting the truth I was about to face. Inside were documents I hadn't touched in over a decade. Deeds, old bank statements, the trust papers with my name in black ink at the top. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal, my chest tightening. It was still mine. Every line confirmed it. Control hadn't passed to him yet, no matter what Claire whispered into his ear. But if they were bold enough to leave me behind at an airport, what else might they be planning? I set the papers on the table and sat down heavily, rubbing my temples. My mind played through every subtle rejection of the past year, every sidelong glance between Daniel and Claire when the topic of money came up. How had I missed it? The hints were all there. Her polished compliments, his hesitant invitations, the way conversations shifted when I entered the room. They weren't simply pushing me aside for convenience. They were clearing the path, and I was the obstacle standing in their way. For a moment, grief threatened to crush me. But then another feeling took its place. A cold, steady resolve. This wasn't just about hurt feelings anymore. This was about survival, about protecting what Margaret and I had built with sweat and sacrifice. I folded the documents back into the envelope, slid it beneath the journal, and whispered to the empty room, "You won't take this from me. Not while I still draw breath." What I didn't know then was how soon that vow would be tested. Because once the truth of what I held became clear to them, silence would no longer be enough, and the fight for dignity would begin in earnest. The days that followed were restless, heavy with thoughts I couldn't outrun. Each morning I would rise before dawn, the way I always had, making coffee in the old drip pot, and sitting by the window as the city stirred awake. But instead of quiet comfort, my mind churned with questions that gnawed at me. Should I confront Daniel? Should I pretend nothing had happened, swallow the humiliation, and carry on like an old man who no longer mattered? Or should I finally take a stand, even if it meant losing the last thread tying me to my son? The apartment was filled with echoes of Margaret's voice, though she'd been gone for so long. I remembered the way she used to scold me gently when I worked myself to exhaustion. "Robert," she'd say, "don't you ever think of yourself." I never did, not then, not now. My life had been built on sacrifice, on giving. But as I sat there, with the documents spread before me, I felt her voice pressing into my chest. Maybe this was the moment she had tried to prepare me for. The day when love and sacrifice were no longer enough, when dignity demanded more than silence. I stared at the photograph of Daniel at 12, the same boy who had promised to take me to see the ocean. His smile in that picture was wide, unguarded, pure. Where had that boy gone? Was he buried beneath years of resentment I never saw growing? Or had he been reshaped entirely by the influence of the woman who now stood at his side? I wanted to believe there was still a trace of him left, that somewhere deep inside, he still carried the memory of the man who had built his world. But believing wasn't enough. I needed to decide whether to fight for that memory, or to let it die with the silence at the airport gate. My chest ached with the weight of both options. Forgiveness would be easier. It would keep the peace, at least on the surface. Yet forgiveness without change would mean surrender. And surrender would mean letting them strip away, not just my money or property, but my very worth. Resistance, on the other hand, would mean stepping into a battle I had never wanted. A father shouldn't have to fight his own child, but as I traced the lines of those legal papers, I knew the fight had already begun. They had drawn first blood the moment they left me, standing alone with my suitcase. I leaned back in the chair, closed my eyes, and whispered to Margaret's picture, "Tell me what to do." But the room remained silent, the only answer the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. In that silence, I realized the decision was mine alone. Age had slowed my body, but not my spirit. And though sorrow pressed against me, I could feel something sharper, stirring beneath it. A quiet fire, steady and unyielding. By the time the sun broke through the blinds, I knew what I had to do. I would no longer be the silent man in the corner, the father erased by convenience. I would rise not with anger, but with resolve. What I didn't know then was how quickly my resolve would be tested, for Daniel and Claire were about to return from their vacation, and their arrival would turn the stillness of my apartment into a storm I could no longer avoid. The day they returned, the air outside was thick with summer heat, pressing against the windows of my apartment like a reminder that the world never paused for grief. I knew the flight schedule by heart. I had looked it up days earlier, against my better judgment, as if preparing for an encounter I wasn't sure I wanted. Still, when evening fell and I heard the sound of a car door slam in the street below, my heart lurched in my chest. I moved to the window and parted the blinds just enough to see. There they were, stepping out of a black sedan, their luggage gleaming with brand new tags from some resort I could only imagine. Claire wore a flowing dress, her skin kissed by sun, her laughter sharp and ringing as she leaned against Daniel's arm. He looked different too, tanned, relaxed, carrying himself with the ease of someone who had forgotten entirely the man left behind at the airport. For a moment, I stood frozen, watching them unload souvenirs from the trunk as though they had returned from some fairy tale. And I wondered, did they think of me even once while they were gone? I stepped back from the window, ashamed of myself for looking. Yet I couldn't stop hearing their voices drift upward, muffled, but clear enough to pierce through the quiet of my home. Claire said something about how wonderful it was to finally travel without obligations. Daniel laughed in agreement, his voice lighter than I'd heard it in years. Obligations. Was that what I had become? The suitcase by my door remained unopened, a silent witness to the betrayal. I stared at it, remembering the shirts I had carefully folded, the toiletries Margaret once teased me for overpacking, all still waiting for a journey that never began. My fingers tightened around the handle until my knuckles ached. How could they come back so easily? Stepping into the house I once helped build, as though nothing had happened. Did they believe my silence would stretch on forever? Later that night, I heard the clinking of glasses through the thin walls. Their celebration carried into my apartment like an insult. Every laugh a reminder of what they had taken. I sat in the dark, the journal open on my lap, my eyes scanning words written years ago about promises and sacrifices. And for the first time in a long while, I felt the fire of anger not wild and reckless, but cold and focused. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had forgotten that the ground they walked on, the roof above their heads, was built by my hands, paid for by my labor. They had forgotten, but I had not. I closed the journal and whispered to the empty room, "The day will come when you'll have to face me." I didn't know how or when, but the truth always finds its way to the surface. And I sensed that soon, very soon, the celebration across the wall would be replaced with a confrontation they weren't prepared for. The invitation came unexpectedly. Daniel knocked on my door the following evening, his voice light, almost casual. "Dad, come over for dinner. Claire made a roast. We should talk." For a moment I hesitated, my hand frozen on the doorknob. Part of me wanted to refuse, to let him feel the weight of my absence the way I had felt his at the gate. But another part, the part that still longed for the boy who once clung to my hand, couldn't turn away. I agreed, though the word felt heavy in my throat. Their dining room smelled of rosemary and garlic, the table set neatly with candles flickering between polished silverware. Claire greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Carter, I'm glad you came," she said, pulling out a chair at the far end of the table. I sat, the journal and documents tucked into my coat pocket, their weight steady against my chest. Daniel poured me a glass of wine, his movements nervous, his eyes avoiding mine. The air between us felt tight, as though every word was being measured before it was spoken. We ate in silence for a while. Claire filled the quiet with stories about their trip, the resorts, the beaches, the fine meals. Her voice carried a pride that scraped against me, as though each detail was chosen to remind me of what I hadn't seen, where I hadn't been. I listened, nodding politely, but inside the words twisted like thorns. Finally, I set my fork down, the clatter sharp against the plate. "Daniel," I said softly, "there's something we need to discuss." His shoulders stiffened. Claire glanced at him, then back at me, her smile faltering. "Dad, maybe tonight isn't the time," he began. But I reached into my coat and placed the envelope on the table, sliding it toward him. The candlelight reflected off the seal, its presence impossible to ignore. "Read it," I said. Daniel's hand hovered above the envelope, trembling slightly. He opened it, pulling out the trust papers, the deeds, the documents he must have hoped I had forgotten. His eyes darted over the words, color draining from his face. Claire leaned closer, her composure cracking for the first time. "What is this?" she whispered sharply. I met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "It's the truth. The house, the savings, the trust, they're not yours to claim. They're still mine, and they always were." Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Daniel set the papers down, his lips parted but no words escaping. Claire's eyes flicked to him, searching for an answer, for control, but for once she found none. I leaned forward, my voice low, deliberate. "You thought leaving me at that airport erased me. But you forgot, Daniel. I built the foundation you stand on. Every brick, every dollar, every sacrifice. And I won't let anyone take that from me." The candles flickered, shadows stretching across their stunned faces. I rose from my chair, the room so quiet I could hear my own breath. "Enjoy your dinner," I said. "But remember, this truth has a way of returning, even when you try to bury it." And with that, I turned and left the table behind. the envelope still lying between them like a wound that could no longer be ignored. What I didn't yet know was how quickly Claire's mask would crumble and how far she would go once she realized control was slipping from her hands. I hadn't been home more than an hour when the knock came. Sharp. Urgent. Nothing like the gentle tap Daniel used as a boy when he wanted me to read him another story before bed. I opened the door to find Claire standing there alone, her arms folded tight across her chest, her eyes glittering with something brittle. Gone was the polished smile, the effortless charm. What stood before me was the raw edge of her fear. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice trembling despite the steel she tried to wrap it in. "We need to talk." She stepped inside without waiting for permission, her heels clicking against the worn floorboards of my apartment. She looked out of place here, like fine porcelain set down in a workshop. Her gaze swept over the suitcase still by the door, the journal on the table, the quiet walls that had borne witness to my solitude. For the first time, I saw her falter. "You don't understand what you've done," she said, her tone rising. "Daniel is confused. He doesn't think clearly when you put things in front of him like that. Those documents, do you know how much pressure he's under? How much we've invested in building a future together?" Her words came in a rush, desperate, as if speed could disguise the cracks forming in her mask. I sat quietly in my chair, letting her voice echo against the walls. When she paused for breath, I asked calmly, "And where did that future leave me, Claire? At an airport gate with a ticket that never existed? Alone with a suitcase meant for a journey I was never meant to take?" The words struck her like stones. She turned her face away, but I saw the flush rise in her cheeks, the shame she tried to smother. She pressed on, her voice sharper now. "Daniel loves you, but you make things hard for him. You cling to the past, to sacrifices that should have been left behind. He can't move forward if you're always reminding him of what he owes." Her hands shook as she spoke, betraying the fear beneath the anger. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and met her eyes. "The past isn't something to be buried, Claire. It's the foundation of who we are. Without it, Daniel has no ground to stand on, and neither do you." For a moment, silence filled the room. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her composure slipping further. I saw then that beneath her confidence was a woman terrified of losing her grip. She turned toward the door, her shoulders rigid. "You'll regret this," she whispered. But her voice lacked the certainty it once carried. When the door closed behind her, I let out a long breath, my chest heavy but steady. For the first time, the mask she had worn so carefully had cracked. What I didn't yet know was that Daniel himself would be the next to unravel, that beneath his silence waited a storm of guilt and reckoning that neither of us could avoid. Daniel came to me the following evening. No wife at his side this time. No polished mask to shield him from the truth. He stood in my doorway like a man who had lost his footing, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes avoiding mine. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence between us carried years of unspoken words, years of sacrifice on one side and resentment on the other. Finally, he whispered, "Dad, can I come in?" I nodded, motioning him toward the chair across from mine. He sat heavily, shoulders slumped, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "Claire told me she came here yesterday," he began. "She said you embarrassed us, that you're trying to take away what's ours." He paused, his voice breaking on the last word. "But when I read those papers again last night, I couldn't sleep. They weren't lies. They were proof." His eyes finally lifted to meet mine, full of something I hadn't seen in a long time. Shame. I stayed quiet, letting him search for his own words. He rubbed his palms together, nervous. "I don't know when it started, Dad. Maybe when I was a teenager, and I saw what other kids had: cars, vacations, homes bigger than ours. I looked at you working yourself to the bone and thought, why not more? Why can't I have what they do? He swallowed hard, his voice trembling. But I forgot what you gave me. I forgot that every single thing I had came from the sweat on your hands. His confession stung, but I let it wash over me. He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. At the airport, I thought, if we just left you behind, it would be easier. Claire said it would make the trip lighter. But when I saw your face, standing there, with your suitcase, his voice cracked, and he buried his face in his hands. I've never felt so small, and now I don't know how to make it right. I closed my eyes, Margaret's voice echoing in my mind, urging me to see the boy still hidden inside the man. When I spoke, my voice was steady. Daniel, you can't erase what you did. You can't undo the shame, the silence, the way you walked away. But you can choose what you do now. You can decide whether you'll keep running from your father or finally stand beside him. Tears slipped from his eyes, though he tried to hide them. I want to, Dad. I just don't know if you can ever forgive me. His words lingered in the room, fragile as glass. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of years pressing on me, and whispered, forgiveness isn't a gift I hand you, son. It's a road you'll have to walk, and only time will tell if your steps are steady. In his silence, I saw both fear and hope. What I didn't know then was how much of that road lay ahead, or whether Daniel would have the strength to walk it. For the moment, all I could feel was the quiet ache of a father who had lost too much and still longed to believe. That night stretched on longer than most. After Daniel left, I sat by the window, the city's lights flickering like distant stars. I could almost reach, but never hold. His words replayed in my mind, each one heavy, each one stitched with regret. Part of me wanted to believe him, to cradle that spark of remorse, as if it were proof that the boy I once knew was still alive beneath the man who abandoned me. Another part of me, the part that still felt the sting of the airport gate, the humiliation of being erased, reminded me that words alone could not mend what had been broken. I looked at the journal lying open on the table, pages filled with years of sacrifices, quiet triumphs, and promises I never allowed myself to forget. That book had carried my story when no one else would. Now, I realized, it was more than memory, it was a lesson. Not just for me, but for Daniel, and maybe one day for his children too. A father's worth is not measured by how easy he is to carry, but by the weight of the love he bore without complaint. In the stillness, I found myself speaking out loud, as if Margaret were listening. He thinks leaving me behind gave him freedom. He doesn't see that freedom built on betrayal is nothing but chains. My voice broke, but I pressed on. I wanted so little. Just a seat beside him. A chance to see the world through his eyes. But maybe my place was never on that plane. Maybe my place is here, reminding him that dignity can't be discarded like baggage. The clock ticked toward midnight. I rose slowly, my body aching, but my spirit steadier than it had been in weeks. I packed the documents into a folder, slid the journal beside them, and placed both in the lockbox. If Daniel ever tried to forget again, if he ever dared to erase me, the truth would still be there, solid, undeniable, waiting. My legacy wasn't in his hands. It was in the evidence of a life lived with love, even when that love was returned with silence. I poured myself a glass of water, sat back down, and stared at the suitcase by the door one last time. I hadn't had the heart to unpack it, But now, I realized it didn't matter. That suitcase no longer represented the trip I missed. It represented the lesson I had learned, that no matter how far a son strays, no matter how heavy the weight of betrayal, a father's dignity always boards first. I don't know if Daniel will ever walk the road back to me. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But when he does, if he does, he'll find me not as a man waiting at the gate, but as a father who stood his ground. And that, I believe, is the only way the story can end.